She was treated like nothing, but she had everything to win. The grand chandelier sparkled above the marble floor, casting golden light over the room filled with elegantly dressed guests. The sound of clinking glasses, polite laughter, and soft classical music filled the air as waiters in crisp uniforms weaved between tables, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne. It was a night of celebration, a gala meant to impress the city's wealthiest and most powerful. Near the entrance, standing by the bar with a tray in her hands, Sophia tried to make herself invisible. She had learned how to do that well over the past few months. Moving quietly, avoiding eye contact, keeping her head down, these were all survival skills in this place. The guests barely noticed her, and the staff only paid her attention when they needed something. To them, she was nothing more than a maid. She adjusted the crisp white apron tied around her waist and took a deep breath, ready to return to work. The uniform felt stiff and foreign on her, but she had gotten used to it. She had gotten used to all of it, the whispers, the condescending glances, the expectation that she would simply accept whatever treatment was thrown her way. "Hey, you! Come here!" The sharp voice made her pause. Sophia turned just in time to see Richard, the hotel's general manager, waving her over impatiently. He was a tall man, always impeccably dressed, with a smug expression that never seemed to leave his face. She had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who believed he owned the world and everyone in it. Sophia hurried over, lowering her gaze as she stopped beside him. "This wine," Richard said, holding up a glass filled with deep red liquid, "isn't what I ordered." Sophia hesitated. She had served him the bottle personally, and she knew for a fact it was exactly what he had asked for. "I'm sorry, sir," she said carefully. "I can get you a different one." Richard's lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, you're sorry? That's not good enough." Before she could react, he lifted the glass and, with a flick of his wrist, poured the entire contents over her head. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The cold liquid soaked through her uniform, dripping down her face and onto the pristine floor beneath her feet. Sophia stood frozen, her hands trembling as the scent of expensive wine filled her nose. Silence stretched for a long moment before laughter broke it apart. It started as a chuckle from Richard, then spread through the group of wealthy guests gathered around him. Some covered their mouths, trying to stifle their amusement, while others didn't bother to hide it. "She looks better that way," someone muttered, and another round of laughter followed. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. The humiliation burned hotter than the wine soaking into her skin. Her fingers curled into fists, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that speaking up would only make things worse. "Clean this up," Richard ordered, tossing the empty glass onto the table. He turned his back on her, already moving on to his next conversation, as if she were nothing more than a stain on the floor. Sophia took a slow breath and forced her shaking hands to steady. With the entire ballroom watching, she bent down, picked up a napkin, and began dabbing at the floor, the wine dripping from her hair onto the fabric. She could feel the weight of their eyes, the quiet whispers, the judgment in every glance. But there was another set of eyes watching. Eyes filled not with mockery, but with something different. Something knowing. Mr. Lancaster, an older gentleman sitting in the corner of the room, had seen everything. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the whiskey in his glass, studying Sophia with quiet intensity. Unlike the others, he did not laugh. He did not smirk. Instead, he lifted his glass in a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. Sophia didn't meet his gaze, but she felt it. A silent understanding passed between them. As she stood up, she straightened her shoulders, adjusting the apron at her waist. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. Instead, she turned, nodded to the bartender, and walked toward the back of the room, head held high. Because unlike the people laughing at her, she knew something they didn't. She was not just a maid. And Richard had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Sophia woke before the sun, just as she had every morning for the past 6 months. The alarm clock's red numbers blinked 4:30 a.m., cutting through the darkness of her tiny apartment. She lay still for a moment, listening to the distant sound of cars on the street below, the muffled voices of early risers starting their day. Then, with a deep breath, she pushed back the thin blanket and swung her feet onto the cold wooden floor. She moved through her morning routine in silence, boiling water for instant coffee, ironing her uniform, tying her thick curls into a tight bun. The mirror above her kitchen sink reflected a face she hardly recognized anymore. Gone was the confident woman who had once walked through the grand halls of that hotel as if she belonged. Now, all that remained was a maid in a crisp white apron, a name tag pinned to her chest like a label announcing her insignificance. At precisely 5:15 a.m., she stepped out into the damp morning air and locked the door behind her. The bus stop was 2 blocks away, past the corner store where Mr. Patel was already arranging his morning newspaper stand. She waved to him, and he nodded back, a small act of kindness in a world that often felt unbearably cruel. The bus was half full, occupied by men and women just like her, maids, janitors, dishwashers, security guards, all heading to the city's grand hotels, restaurants, and office buildings. People who kept the world running while remaining invisible to those they served. Sophia took a seat by the window, watching as the city came to life. Tall buildings stretched toward the sky, glittering under the first light of dawn. She used to admire their beauty. Now, they only reminded her of how far she had fallen. By 6 a.m., she arrived at the hotel's back entrance. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and damp pavement. She stepped inside and was immediately met with the familiar routine, punching her time card, slipping into the staff locker room, nodding to the other maids who barely looked up from their own tasks. "Morning, Sophia," whispered Maria, one of the few friendly faces in the staff quarters. "Morning," Sophia replied, forcing a small smile. Maria was older, with graying hair pulled into a bun and tired eyes that had seen too much. She had worked at the hotel for over 15 years and had long since learned not to ask questions. Still, she often gave Sophia little bits of advice, how to avoid Richard's wrath, which guests to be extra polite to, and which hallways were best for sneaking a moment of rest. "The breakfast shift is short-staffed again," Maria murmured as they walked toward the service entrance. "Richard's in a foul mood." Sophia merely nodded. Richard was always in a foul mood. He carried himself like a king overseeing his kingdom, barking orders, belittling staff, and ensuring everyone knew their place. And to him, Sophia's place was at the very bottom. She pushed through the double doors leading to the ballroom, where tables were already being set for the morning service. The scent of warm croissants and fresh fruit filled the air, and the polished silverware gleamed under the chandeliers. Waiters moved quickly, arranging place settings, while chefs in white coats prepared elaborate dishes for guests who would hardly notice the effort. Sophia took her station near the coffee cart, filling cups with precision, refilling sugar bowls, and keeping her movements swift and efficient. She had learned early on that if she worked quickly and quietly, she would be ignored. And being ignored was better than being noticed. Midway through the shift, she felt a presence behind her before she even heard the voice. "You missed a spot." Richard's voice was laced with condescension as he pointed to a faint coffee ring on the tray beside her. Sophia bit the inside of her cheek and wiped it away without a word. Richard didn't move. Instead, he took a slow sip of his espresso, watching her with that smug expression she had come to loathe. "You're lucky to have this job," he said casually. "I could replace you tomorrow if I wanted to." She met his gaze for just a second before looking away. He wanted a reaction, but she refused to give him one. "Understood, sir," she said, keeping her voice even. Richard smirked, as if pleased with himself, before turning away to berate a waiter for folding a napkin incorrectly. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. The wealthy guests dined on eggs Benedict and smoked salmon while chatting about weekend getaways and stock market fluctuations. To them, Sophia was nothing more than part of the scenery, a faceless servant ensuring their comfort. By noon, she was cleaning up the remnants of breakfast when she overheard 2 guests near the entrance. "I heard the owner's daughter is back in town," one of them said. Sophia's hand tightened around the linen napkin she was folding. "Oh," the other guest replied. "I thought she left years ago." "She did. But who knows? Maybe she's looking to reclaim what was hers." The word sent a chill down Sophia's spine. She turned away before they could notice her eavesdropping and quickly busied herself with clearing the table. If people were already whispering, it meant time was running out. She had spent months watching, waiting, and collecting the evidence she needed. She had endured Richard's cruelty, the guests' indifference, and the staff's silence, all for this moment. Soon, very soon, the world would remember who she was. And Richard? He would regret ever thinking she was beneath him. Sophia moved through the hotel halls with quiet precision, her polished black shoes clicking against the marble floor. The air smelled of expensive perfume and freshly brewed coffee, a scent she had come to associate with power, power that did not belong to people like her. At least, not yet. She had spent months blending into the background, collecting scraps of information, listening in on hushed conversations that people assumed the hotel staff were too insignificant to notice. But the truth was, she noticed everything. That morning, after overhearing the guests whisper about the owner's daughter, a deep unease settled in her chest. If people were already talking, that meant it was only a matter of time before someone started connecting the dots. At precisely 3 p.m., she received the usual folded note on the service tray. A simple time and place scribbled in ink. Library. 4:15. Sophia tucked it into the pocket of her apron and continued her work, keeping her movements measured. To any outsider, it was just another quiet afternoon at the hotel. But beneath the surface, something far bigger was unfolding. By the time she made her way to the library, the golden afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the antique bookshelves. The hotel's private library was rarely used by guests, making it the perfect meeting place. Mr. Lancaster was already there, sitting in his usual chair by the fireplace, his hands resting on the cane he rarely needed. He looked up as she entered, his deep-set eyes sharp as ever. "You've been careful?" he asked without preamble. Sophia nodded, taking a seat across from him. "I always am." The older man studied her for a moment before exhaling slowly. "Word is spreading. People are starting to remember." "I heard," she said. "That's why we need to move soon." Mr. Lancaster gave a thoughtful nod. "I've done what I can to stall Richard, but he's getting greedy. He's been siphoning money from the hotel's accounts. If we wait much longer, he'll have it hidden so well, not even the law can touch him." Sophia clenched her jaw. She wasn't surprised. Richard had never been the type to settle for enough. He took and took, never believing he would be caught. "There's one last piece of information I need," she said. "The documents proving the fraudulent transfers, do you have them?" Mr. Lancaster reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. "This is everything. The evidence that will force the board to take action." Sophia picked it up, running her fingers over the thick paper. This was it. The final piece. For a moment, silence hung between them, filled only by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "You never had to do this, you know," Mr. Lancaster said, his voice softer now. "You could have walked away." Sophia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "No, I couldn't." He sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Your father would be proud." A sharp pain flickered in her chest at the mention of him. "I hope so." Her father had built this hotel from the ground up. He had poured everything into it, his time, his money, his dreams. And when he died, Richard had been there like a vulture, twisting legal loopholes to push her out before she had a chance to fight back. She had spent years trying to reclaim what was hers. Not because she needed the wealth or the prestige, but because of what it represented. Justice. Legacy. The chance to rewrite the story Richard had stolen from her. And now, she was finally close. What happens when Richard finds out? Mr. Lancaster asked, watching her carefully. Sophia smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Then we see what kind of man he really is. Because she already knew, Richard was the type to lash out when backed into a corner. He would try to hold onto his power with both hands, but she was ready for that. She had waited too long, endured too much, to let him win. She stood, tucking the envelope safely inside her apron pocket. Tomorrow, everything changes. Mr. Lancaster gave a slow nod, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like pride. Then I'll be waiting. Sophia left the library with steady steps, her heart pounding not with fear, but with the anticipation of what was to come. Tomorrow, Richard would finally learn the truth. And he wouldn't see it coming. The night before the confrontation, Sophia lay awake in her tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling. The envelope with the final documents rested on the nightstand beside her, as if whispering reminders of what was to come. Tomorrow, Richard's reign over the hotel would come crashing down. For months, she had worked in silence, enduring every insult, every humiliation, waiting for the moment when she could strike back. She had watched Richard bask in his power, treating her like nothing while he stole from the very business he pretended to run. And he had no idea that the woman he tormented daily was the same one who could take everything from him with a single signature. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow. Sophia arrived at the hotel at the usual time, slipping through the back entrance as she always did. The air in the staff quarters was thick with the morning routine, maids gathering cleaning supplies, chefs barking orders in the kitchen, waiters smoothing their uniforms before stepping onto the floor. Everything appeared normal. But today was not a normal day. She moved through her morning shift with quiet precision, serving coffee, clearing plates, nodding politely when spoken to. She watched Richard from the corner of her eye as he walked through the dining hall, sipping his espresso, oblivious to the storm about to hit him. By noon, it was time. She made her way to the executive offices, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands. Mr. Lancaster was waiting outside the boardroom, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "They're all in there," he murmured. "It's time." Sophia nodded, inhaled deeply, and stepped inside. The room fell silent as she entered. The board members, men and women in tailored suits, paused mid-conversation, their eyes flicking to her in confusion. Richard, seated at the head of the long mahogany table, looked up from his papers with an annoyed scowl. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. Sophia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the center of the room and placed the envelope on the table. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice steady. Richard let out a sharp laugh, leaning back in his chair. "What could you possibly have to say that matters?" She ignored him. Instead, she turned to the board members. "For months, I've been collecting evidence," she said. "Richard has been stealing from this hotel, funneling money into fake accounts, bribing inspectors, and cutting corners to pocket extra cash." Murmurs spread through the room. Some of the board members exchanged glances, others looked to Richard for a response. Richard's expression twisted into something cruel. "This is absurd. She's just a maid. Why would you believe anything she says?" Sophia didn't flinch. Instead, she opened the envelope and pulled out the documents, pages of financial records, signatures, proof of fraudulent transactions. She laid them out on the table, pushing them toward the nearest board member. "Because I'm not just a maid," she said evenly. "I'm Sophia Harrington." The room fell into complete, stunned silence. Richard's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his hands clenching into fists. The board members sat in shock, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. "I am the rightful owner of this hotel," Sophia continued, her voice strong. "Richard manipulated the legal process after my father passed away, ensuring that I had no claim. But I never left. I stayed and watched as he ran this place into the ground." One of the board members, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes, picked up the documents and flipped through them. She frowned, looking at Richard. "These are serious accusations," she said. "If this is true..." "It's not." Richard exploded, standing so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "This is ridiculous. She's lying. She's—" "The numbers don't lie," Mr. Lancaster interrupted, stepping forward. "I've been overseeing the accounts myself, and I can confirm everything she's saying is true." Richard's mouth opened and closed, his breath coming in short bursts. His mind was racing, searching for a way out, a way to twist the truth in his favor. But there was no escape. A security guard entered the room. "Mr. Harrington," he said, addressing Sophia with respect. "Would you like us to remove Mr. Richard?" Richard's face twisted with fury. "You can't do this." Sophia stepped forward, her eyes locked on him. "I just did." The guard took Richard by the arm. He resisted at first, then realized there was no one in the room who would defend him. The board members were already talking among themselves, their expressions turning from shock to agreement. As Richard was dragged toward the door, he turned back, his voice filled with venom. "You'll regret this." Sophia held his gaze. "No, Richard. You will." And then he was gone. A heavy silence filled the boardroom. Then, slowly, the woman who had spoken earlier stood up and extended her hand. "Welcome back, Miss Harrington." Sophia shook it firmly. She had done it. She had reclaimed what was hers. As the boardroom doors closed behind Richard, an eerie silence filled the space. For months, Sophia had imagined this moment, the moment he would finally realize that the world he had built on lies and cruelty was crumbling beneath him. Yet, now that it was here, she felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction. Just a deep, steady calm. The board members sat in stunned silence, flipping through the incriminating documents she had presented. Mr. Lancaster, standing beside her, folded his hands over his cane, watching them with a knowing expression. It was the woman at the far end of the table, Margaret Dawson, one of the longest-serving board members, who finally broke the silence. This is undeniable," she said, shaking her head as she placed the documents down. "The financial discrepancies, the fraud, it's all here." Another board member, a man with silver hair and an expensive watch, nodded in agreement. "The evidence is overwhelming. We can't ignore it." Sophia clasped her hands together, allowing them to process what had just happened. Then she spoke again. "As of today, I will be assuming my rightful place as owner of the Harrington Grand Hotel," she said, her voice steady but firm. "And I intend to make drastic changes." Murmurs rippled across the table. Another board member hesitated. "Miss Harrington, while Richard's removal was necessary, running a luxury hotel is complicated. Do you have experience managing something of this scale?" Sophia met his gaze without hesitation. "I have been here, every single day, watching. I have seen the failures in management, the way this hotel has been allowed to deteriorate under Richard's leadership. I have seen guests treated like royalty while staff are overworked and humiliated." She let her words settle before continuing. "I have studied every part of this operation, and I know what needs to change." A few board members nodded in quiet agreement, their skepticism softening. Margaret cleared her throat. "What do you propose?" Sophia straightened her shoulders. "First, the hotel's financials will be fully audited to recover every stolen dollar Richard funneled away. Second, staff wages will be increased. I've seen the conditions they've been forced to work under, and that ends today." She took a breath. "And third, we will restore the reputation my father built. This hotel was once known for excellence, not corruption. That is what it will be again." Silence hung in the air. Then, one by one, the board members nodded in agreement. "I think we've heard enough," Margaret finally said, glancing at the others. "Miss Harrington, we're prepared to reinstate you as the rightful owner." A weight lifted from Sophia's chest. "It's done, then," Mr. Lancaster said, his voice soft but firm. A slow smile spread across Sophia's lips. "Yes. It's done." The following morning, the hotel was alive with whispers. Something had shifted overnight, though no one knew exactly what had happened. Staff members spoke in hushed voices in the break room, speculating about why Richard had left so suddenly, why Sophia, the maid they had barely noticed, was now walking through the halls with quiet authority. In the grand lobby, a group of guests gathered near the check-in desk, murmuring among themselves as Sophia stepped into view. She wasn't wearing her maid's uniform today. Instead, she wore an elegant navy blue suit, her presence commanding attention. The concierge, who had barely spared her a glance before, now stood at full attention. The waitstaff whispered her name with wide eyes. Some of the older employees, the ones who had been there when her father ran the hotel, exchanged looks of understanding. And then, the moment came. Sophia stepped forward, addressing the gathered staff. As of today, she announced, her voice steady and clear, there are new rules. Murmurs spread through the crowd, but no one spoke. The culture in this hotel will change. No longer will staff be treated as disposable. No longer will management look down on those who work the hardest. She paused, letting her words sink in. This is not just my hotel. This is our hotel. And together, we will make it what it was meant to be. A slow, hesitant clap broke the silence. Then another. And another. Until the entire room erupted in applause. Some of the staff members who had suffered the most under Richard's rule wiped away tears. The waiters, the maids, the doormen, they all stood a little taller. Sophia looked out at them and felt something swell in her chest. Not triumph. Not revenge. But justice. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at home. As the applause slowly died down, Sophia took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over her. This wasn't just about reclaiming her father's hotel. It wasn't about revenge either. It was about something bigger, restoring dignity to the people who had been treated as invisible for far too long. She stepped forward, making eye contact with as many staff members as possible, ensuring they saw her, that they understood she wasn't just another figurehead who would disappear into an office and forget them. This hotel was built on my father's vision, she continued, her voice strong but warm. Not just as a place for the wealthy to enjoy, but as a place where hard work was respected, where people were treated fairly. Somewhere along the way, that was lost. She paused, letting the words sink in. But today, we start again. A few waiters exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet agreement. The older employees, those who had worked under her father, stood with their shoulders back, their eyes shining with something like hope. There will be changes, Sophia went on. Better wages, fairer hours, and a workplace where no one is humiliated or mistreated. Her gaze flickered to Maria, the longtime maid who had quietly guided her through the difficult months of pretending to be just another worker. Maria smiled softly, her hands clasped together. Sophia turned toward the concierge, a man who had worked under Richard for years and had followed his lead, looking down on those beneath him. Everyone deserves respect, she said. And that starts now. The concierge swallowed hard, nodding, his gaze dropping. He understood. Sophia let the silence stretch for a moment before finally offering a small smile. For those who have worked tirelessly despite the challenges, I see you. I appreciate you. And this hotel, our hotel, will be better because of you. Another wave of applause followed, this time mixed with murmured agreement, people turning to each other with cautious but growing optimism. As the crowd began to disperse, Sophia felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Mr. Lancaster, his usual composed expression softened. You handled that well, he murmured. Sophia exhaled. I hope so. He nodded. Your father would be proud. Her chest tightened, but she managed a small smile. Thank you. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the staff returned to their work. There was a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. The weight of oppression had been lifted, and in its place, there was possibility. As Sophia turned toward the main entrance, her gaze landed on the polished golden plaque by the front doors. It read, Harrington Grand Hotel. She traced her fingers lightly over the name, feeling the smooth metal beneath her fingertips. For so long, this place had been a reminder of what she had lost. Now, it was a symbol of what she had reclaimed. She stepped outside, inhaling the crisp morning air. The city bustled around her, unaware of the quiet revolution that had just taken place inside the grand building. As she stood there, absorbing the moment, a thought crossed her mind. Justice had been served, but the work wasn't over. It never truly was. She turned back toward the hotel, her heart steady. This was just the beginning. Sophia's story teaches us that dignity, perseverance, and justice are worth fighting for, no matter how long the battle takes. It reminds us that power does not always rest with those who wear expensive suits or sit at the head of the table. Sometimes, it belongs to those who endure in silence, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what is rightfully theirs. In many ways, life challenges us to decide whether we will accept injustice or stand against it, even when the odds seem insurmountable. As we grow older, we recognize that true strength isn't about loud victories, but about quiet resilience, about holding onto our values even when the world tries to strip them away. Sophia's journey is a testament to the idea that patience, wisdom, and integrity always triumph over greed and cruelty. It encourages us to never underestimate our own worth, no matter how others perceive us. Whether in our personal lives, workplaces, or communities, we must remember that respect and fairness should never be luxuries, they should be standards. In the end, what truly defines us is not what we have, but how we stand up for what is right, even when no one else does.